Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Today, we're going to be talking about another heavy metal book. This is one that I picked up over the holidays and had time to read, so I thought I'd share my thoughts on it. It's not a brand new book, but it's not that old either. We're going to be talking about USBM, US Black Metal, A Revolution of Identity in American Black Metal, written by Daniel Lake. A lot of folks will know Daniel's name from his contributions to Decibels, and I think Chronicles of Chaos is another one that he worked with for quite a while. This was put out by Decibel a couple of years ago. I had just never gotten around to picking it up, but finally did. I knew I'd have some downtime during the holidays to catch up on reading, which meant I bought too many books and now I'm behind again. But I have recently finished this one off, so I thought I'd share thoughts on it. Now, this book, when it came out a couple of years ago, it did garner some unfavorable reviews from some folks. Just for example, Matt over at the now defunct Dark Path channel, he had some, real issues with this book when he read it. You can check out his video. Stuff is still posted on the Dark Path, and you can see what, his contentions were with it. Some of them I think were fair. Some of them I do disagree with, having read the book myself now. As the name suggests, this is, basically trying to chronicle the US black metal scene. It's organized in a pretty straightforward way. You've got, chapters on different bands, so basically going band by band. Some of it's kind of roughly chronological, uh, but of course you can't do it perfectly that way. The book, though, is also divided up into kind of sections. So the chapters are kind of, grouped into these larger headings. The headings, one thing that's a little like tongue in cheek about it, the section titles are actually snippets from um, the Star Spangled Banner, but kind of black metal-fied. So, like, section one is called "Oh Satan, Can You See?" And the next section is called "The Dawn's Early Spite." I could have done without that. I'll just be honest. It's kind of cute in a bad dad joke kind of way. It's not horribly annoying. It doesn't ruin the book or anything, but it has a little bit of that kind of, womp womp feel to it that, this is a topic that, some people take very seriously and some people take too seriously. But those section headers may not be taking it quite seriously enough. I get the idea. Yes, you're trying to emphasize that it's US, aka American black metal, and you're using, the American national anthem, but I don't know. I'd like to think even I wouldn't stoop to puns this low, but for being honest, I might stoop to puns this low, but I don't think I would use it for my section headers in a book like this. Anyway, the sections though do provide some, structure to it. For example, this section, "The Dawn's Early Spite," starts off, with, pioneers of the scene. So you're kind of getting a look at, early US black metal with things like Vaughn, Absu, Profanatica, Demon Seed, Judas Iscariot, et cetera, et cetera. And, subsequent sections. Let's take a look here. The next one covers, the California scene from the early 2000s. So this is where you get into discussing chapters on Weakling, Xasthur, Leviathan, Ludicra, etc. The next section covers some of the Chicago scene with Usurper, Noctimistium, Twilight. The section after that is kind of the grab bag with, bands from different scenes just around North America. This was one of the things that some reviews, Matt's in particular, took issue with on the book was that it didn't really seem to focus on scenes very much. But given the organization of it, I feel like he actually did a relatively good job of focusing on scenes. So I'd have to disagree with that criticism from some other reviews. Granted, yes, it's a little hard to focus on US black metal as a scene for several reasons. First off, the US is a huge place. It's going to have to be divided up into sub areas. What bands are doing in Southern California in the early 2000s doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on what bands were doing in New England in the same time frame. Just, the sheer volume of geography you have to traverse means it's not all one big scene. But it's also hard to talk about, US black metal in terms of localized scenes because a lot of these projects, of course, are like one person projects, maybe two-person projects. There are areas certainly where you had a lot of bands in the traditional sense with, four or five members active. California seems to have had more of those, for example. But yeah, to have a scene, you need to generally have clubs, areas, bars, venues that are letting this stuff be played. You've got to have a certain critical mass of, you know, bands that are playing live, and then you have to have, some semblance of a fan base is coming and listening to them. And those are just hard ingredients to get to line up in US black metal. So many of the projects are only one or two people. They're right away projects that aren't going to go out and play live very much. There's, famously a lot of black metal bands are the quote unquote bedroom kind of projects. Even some of the bigger name ones are essentially, yeah, studio projects that have rarely played live very much. Also, there's not a ton of demand for this in live venues in a lot of places. So, there's been relatively few chances for these bands to, establish local scenes like you would think of in the same context of Bay Area thrash scene or new wave of British heavy metal around London, early 1980s scene. Um, it's also, a much more extreme fringe kind of music, so your fan base right away is going to be, smaller than it is for other types of music scenes. So those things are kind of working against having a really strict scene-based organization to the book, but I still think it works pretty well in that sense. Continuing on, there's a section on, the cascading stuff with, Agalloch, Wolves in the Throne Room. There's a section on the New York scene that covers Crowless, Black Anvil, Tombs, mutilation rites. There's another chapter on California's kind of second wave scene, which was Death Heaven, Black Twilight Circle. Who else is here? Mastery. And then the last section is kind of, wraps up, with a few, at the time, current bands, maybe starting to move in different directions. So actually, I do like the organization of the book overall. The fact that, it's one chapter per band. That's pretty standard for this kind of volume. But these overarching sections, even if they have kind of corny names, did try to group things into scenes as much as one could reasonably expect. All right, another thing, that very first section in the book, one of the things it focuses on, the chapter, or one of the chapters included in it, is just called Bad Shit in Black Metal. And it spends a few pages, highlighting some of the very controversial issues that have cropped up with some of these bands. Uh, you know, it touches on some of the extreme right wing stuff that goes on. Touches on some of the allegations of sexual assault, misconduct, criminal activity by different artists on this scene. And some people took a real issue with that uh, in their reviews as well. Some people didn't like the fact that this was included in the first place. And my take on it is I think it actually was the right thing to do. You really can't, if you're going to discuss, US black metal and not bring up any of, the controversies with it, you're kind of blatantly tiptoeing around a lot of stuff at that point. Not every band is full of Nazis. Not every band has gone out, and assaulted people or beat people or, turned into a total, drugged out loser or anything. But there has been a fair amount of that in the scene. And I think it was probably the right choice by Daniel to just go ahead and address that right up front and get it out of the way. Now, when I say get it out of the way, it's not like he never brings it back up in the rest of the book. It's definitely touched on in chapters with certain bands. But I think it would have been very weird not to have addressed that aspect of the scene or to have it just kind of scattered a little here and a little there. Well, again, it makes it a bit confrontational, maybe to some people, that to have it right there in the front of the book. And it's going to make it uncomfortable to some people to have to read that in the front of the book. But it's a thing, it exists, and rather than ignore it or just kind of, bury it here and there in footnotes, I think it probably was the right choice just to go ahead right up front and say, like, hey, this is an extreme type of music. It attracts some extreme personalities, and some of that, has definitely spilled over into, some pretty unseemly kinds of activities. Along that note, one thing I did notice going through the book, however, is that there may be some inconsistencies on when those things are called out and when those things are not. Certain more, high profile artists or high profile cases are definitely mentioned. Others I didn't see mentioned anywhere. It's possible I overlooked it while reading, but there were a couple of projects when I got to them and reading through these entries. I'm like, huh, he's not bringing up the multiple associations of this person with fascist imagery and terminology and all that stuff. We just given this one a pass. Okay, I guess we're just not going to talk about that with this particular artist, although it has been touched on with other artists. I'm not sure if Daniel had certain criteria that maybe he was only trying to bring up the really high profile things and not let the book constantly get dragged down into that. Okay, I guess that's fair. It may also have been trying to stick to things that that had a lot of supporting documentation, like where charges had been filed or people had been arrested. That it was pretty clear. Things had gone on to some extent or another. With some of these things and some of these artists, there's never been a crime committed by them. It's more the guilt by association, but it's like you're guilty because you keep reassociating with it over and over and over again. So it's kind of clear that you're into white supremacy or any of that kind of stuff. But no, you've never gone out and attacked anybody. Maybe the line was kind of set there. It's like, well, if we want to mention everybody that has a un uh, nice or kind of seedy tie to them, the whole thing just falls apart. I don't know. I don't know if there were certain parameters that Daniel felt like, okay, if the band has done something this bad, I need to address it. And if it's just a matter of, oh yeah, they keep having a sun wheel in the background of their artwork or something, we'll let people pick that out themselves. So the book is not, I guess my point is, the book's not just a never-ending list of pointing out, every single person who's ever had an accusation leveled against them. It's, the kind of bigger, more well-known issues that are brought up, which again makes sense when you're kind of chronicling what's happened in the scene. All right. Beyond that, the book reads pretty straightforward, fairly well. If you're familiar with Daniel's writing style and Decibel and such, it's the same kind of style here. It's pretty straightforward. He did a very good job of getting lots of people from the scene interviewed. Obviously, not everybody could be. Some people, a lot of the members, folks associated with Weakling, for instance, no, there's no new revelations. From the main guy behind Weakling because he wants nothing to do with it and told Daniel so very bluntly. And that was that. But it feels like he touched on as many folks as he could. He contacted as many as and got them involved if they wanted to be involved. I know some reviews were a bit critical, for example, that there are some label-based chapters, relatively short ones, but like the Flenser, Gilead, Binder, and each have, short chapters devoted to them. A big one that doesn't is Moribund Records. Now, Odin from Moribund is, quoted quite a bit in here in reference to different bands. So he did talk to him. Not sure why there wasn't a chapter devoted to the label itself, though. It seems like that would have been something to include in that first section on, kind of the early pioneers of US black metal. Yeah, at the same time, there's been a lot of accusations by different artists leveled at Moribund, have bad contracts, unable to get rights back, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe there are certain legal controversies or something going on or litigation that's still pending that would have made it extremely awkward to have a chapter about Moribund. I don't know. But it's one of the few noticeable things that probably could have used a chapter that isn't included. But yeah, there may have been a reason for that. Reading through the book, some things that stand out to me. A lot of the chapters are relatively short, which emphasizes the fact that, again, there's not a lot of members involved with some of these projects, and a lot of them did not last very long. You've got, a handful of demos or, your one EP, one album release, two albums, and a lot of these bands were kind of wrapped up, and that was the end of the project. The artists moved on to other things, or there simply, wasn't any viability in keeping some of these projects going. In some cases, you feel the project was so mired down in controversy, the artists pretty much had to abandon it because, yeah, they were going to get nothing but flack moving forward. A project like Grand Belial's Key would be a good example, that might have fallen into that category. So, yeah, the chapters tend to be pretty short for the most part. And that reflects, kind of the bigger thing. And it's something, that Daniel does touch on, and a lot of the interviewees touch on too, is that, the US black metal scene has always lived in the shadow of the European black metal scene. And even now, and at this point, as of time of recording, we're in early 2024, I think it still feels that way to a lot of people. Even though US black metal has come a long way, I mean, you can write this many words at least about it as of about 2021. But yeah, it still does feel like, US black metal in a lot of people's minds is, a second tier scene. And that's probably a very unfair association. There's been a lot of, very talented artists and a lot of very good music put out on the US scene, but it still has, a very distinct feel, if nothing else, from the European scene. At first, if you look at some of these early bands, some of these bands were very much, originally trying to emulate what happened in Europe. Early Judas Iscariot's a good example of that. They was very much trying to copy what was happening in Scandinavia to the best of, his abilities. As you went through time, U.S. black metal did develop its own identity though, which I guess is what he's hinting at with the title of the book, a revolution in identity in American black metal. Yes, you have the Cascadian black metal, and some of that stuff comes maybe closer to the Scandinavia because of the emphasis on wilderness, forest imagery, and all of that. You get some of that too from like bands like Panopticon that you wouldn't consider part of Cascadian black metal, but that same nature-based connection. But then you also have a lot of bands in here that are mentioned as more going into just like more darkened sounds influenced by urban environments. The bands in the New York scene, parts of the California scene, the development of the suicidal depressive styles of black metal, which most people quoted in here really didn't like that term, felt that it was just, yeah, that's just something that you'll grab headlines or catch people's attention with, but doesn't really describe the music that well. Okay, fair enough. But yeah, nevertheless, at the end of the day, having read this, it does still feel like US black metal has never quite broken through or seen the same level of success as a lot of their European counterparts. That's not necessarily a criticism, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I've mentioned with other smaller metal scenes that sometimes staying a little below the radar gives you a lot more artistic freedom to do your thing without interference from bigger labels or having to, deal with larger tours and merchandising that, could start to, compromise your artistic vision. For example, a lot of new wave of traditional heavy metal bands, they're not going to turn into Iron Maiden. They don't have to worry about those kind of pressures. They're not going to have EMI or Epic or, some giant label telling them how to look or what to do. They can pretty much play what they want to play, look how they want to look, sell a few albums here, do a few small tours there. It's not going to become their lifeblood, but in a way that may give them legs to make it a more long-running project than a band that gets crushed under the weight of mega expectations by a huge fan base and stuff. Maybe the same is true for a lot of US black metal bands that they can just kind of keep doing their own thing, kind of over there in the shadows a little bit, and they don't have to worry about big labels wanting them to update their image or change their artwork or stuff like that. Yeah, nevertheless, I do find it kind of interesting that if you stop and think, who are the big bands in US black metal, and how does that list compare to the European list? Are there any US black metal bands that are really on that same tier as, the biggest Scandinavian bands? If you ask a black metal fan to start naming black metal bands, it's going to go something like this: Mayhem, Burzum, Emperor, Darkthrone, Immortal, Satyricon. All right, I've already reeled off half a dozen without even thinking about it. They're all Scandinavian. How far down that list would the average black metal fan have to go before they named a US band? I don't know. You know, what are the biggest bands in US black metal? Well, let's think. First one in my mind that started to make an impact, and start to get, some visibility was Judas Iscariot. Now there were ones before that, Absu, Vaughn, but these are not, names that most people are going to cite off the top of their head whatsoever. Uh, you know, Leviathan got fairly big. Panopticon's gotten fairly big. Noctimistium had, a moment there where they were actually quite visible. It fell apart, of course. Wolves in the Throne Room is one of the bigger ones these days. I'm guessing Wolves would be the first band that most people would name from the US. You know, perhaps Panopticon, Austin's got a very big fan base too. But you don't really feel like any of those bands, are on that same level of, legacy or notoriety as, a Mayhem or Emperor or Immortal. They always feel like, yeah, there's that group. And then, further down the list, you get this US group. And again, that's not a reflection of quality or anything. It just shows that, yeah, the US bands have never quite, had that same level of visibility as the European bands. Maybe some of that goes back even to the roots regarding first wave black metal. Before I started recording today, I was thinking like, yeah, where are all the first wave bands from the 80s from? They're almost all from the UK and Europe. Venom, Merciful Fate, uh, Bathory, Hellhammer, early Celtic Frost. Even if you get into like, the more, black and thrash part, you're not naming Metallica and Megadeth, you're naming Creator, Sodom, the early German stuff. People even want to throw, the first Running Wild album in there. Okay, still in Germany. How far down the list do you have to go to name a first wave black metal band from the United States? I pulled up a couple of websites just to see what they listed. I couldn't find much of anything. The first one that came to my mind was the Enemy Unholy Death album. And even that might be a bit of a stretch to cram into the black metal sect. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much I like that entry there either. Some of the others I saw I thought were kind of silly. I wouldn't put them in their black metal at all. Maybe you make a case for Slayer, Show No Mercy, although you don't often hear that referred to as early black metal. Same with Possessed. Possessed Seven Churches is always referred to as, it's in the argument for earliest death metal album. I don't hear it brought up in the black metal conversation a whole lot. So yeah, even the first metal roots, the US just doesn't seem to have much of a presence there, which is kind of funny considering so much of the satanic panic happened in the US, but you actually don't have any US bands looking back that really were, to the overt, black metal Satanism aesthetic, which was really the only thing that defined first wave black metal. It wasn't a musical style, it was just a how evil, how many times can you say Satan, yay, Satan, rah, rah, shish, boom, bah, cheerlead for Satan in your song? So, yeah, kind of, interesting going through this book too, that you get to the end of it, it's like, yeah, there's really not many US black metal bands that have ever, reached those, really high levels of visibility. Yeah, another thing is, like I said, a lot of these projects very short-lived. I guess we are getting to the point where some of them have been around long enough to establish a bit more of a legacy for themselves. When you look at this first section on the bands from the early scene, Well, let's take a look, see how many of them you'd consider like, still active. Absu, Postscriptor is still doing stuff with a different project, but Absu itself, has not remained a going concern. Pro Fanatica is still around putting stuff out, but that's a band that, had very little activity, especially early in their career. They've kind of gotten more serious and consistent later in time. They didn't do a lot in the early days. The main guy from Pro Fanatica actually sort of, laments that in the book. He's like, we really should have done more stuff early to, put our stamp on the scene. Judas Iscariot flamed out. Inquisition, are they still technically around? I guess. That band, of course, mired in controversy. One of the few in this section that I guess, you could think of as kind of a legacy project at this point would be Krieg. Well, Demon Sea is still around, also doing stuff. Um, but yeah, both, those are not household names for even a lot of black metal fans. Some people are going to know them and love them a lot. A lot of people are going to be like, well, I never really checked out Krieg or, oh, Demon Sea. Yeah, I think I heard one of their albums once. They're they're still around and going, and that's great. But yeah, there's not a lot of those bands that have, continued on. Whereas, we could name, probably a couple of dozen Norwegian bands that have had that same kind of, 30-ish year legacy as we go into the early, or actually at this point, I guess we're going into the mid 2020s. Lots of Norwegian and Swedish bands have been around since the mid 90s. Very few of those early US bands are still active on the scene. And then once you get into the early 2000s, yes, more of those projects, have had like a 20-year run, although even some of those have changed. Zasther's moved way out of black metal circles, apparently. Leviathan has some, big, gaps. Years and years go by where you don't get anything from Leviathan. So yeah, you don't have bands steadily putting stuff out like an Immortal or a Dark Throne. I don't know what that says about the scene. It's just an observation I kind of registered in my brain as I read through the book. So let's wrap this on up. Yeah, in conclusion, it's a good read if you're interested in the scene, if you're interested in learning more about the scene. It's not a scene that I knew a ton about. There were some projects in here that I did remember and hadn't thought of in years. Like I saw Noctuaries, like, oh, holy crap, I had that album, but it was 20 years ago. I don't even know what happened to it. I guess I got rid of it. So kind of fun to, yeah, freshen up on a few things that I did hear back in the day. You know, Daniel makes it very clear this is not an exhaustive, treatment. There are definitely bands that, didn't get included for whatever reason. I know I had, some demo projects. I had like Epoch of Unlight. They might could have been in here. There's, I think, a Texas band called Of the Fallen did some good demos. They weren't mentioned in here. Yeah, and it's also just, this is kind of US black metal at this point in time. As he says himself in the sort of closing pages of the book, this book will be woefully out of date 10 years from now because some of these bands are still going steadily. New bands are going to show up. Things are going to continue to change and evolve and develop. So, this just kind of tells you US black metal up to this point of publication. Maybe sometime 10 years down the road, there's a US black metal volume 2 book that kind of catches us up on what's happened since then. But yeah, I'd say, a good read for people who are interested in the scene, learning a little bit more about it, and finding out about, some more of these smaller projects that, haven't had a lot of visibility, that'd be very easy to miss if you are not somebody who's paid a lot of attention to US black metal, especially over the past 20 to 25 years. All right, that is going to do it for now. So now let's talk black metal and this book and related topics in the comments down below. Have you read the book? And if so, what are your thoughts with it? Did you have any glaring issues with the book that I didn't point out? Were there particularly strong points or sections of the book that you think, people, it's worth their time to read that you want to shout out as well? And yeah, can you think of other first wave US black metal projects from the 80s that, you know, where were they? I'm sure there are some, maybe they were only more demo level kind of stuff that I'm just not aware of. Is there a big name black metal band from the US now that really should be up there on that upper echelon next to Emperor Immortal Darkthrone in terms of visibility. Is Wolves in the Throne Room big enough for that? They're one of the few on a bigger label. I know there are some people that really dislike that band. I'm not sure if it's strictly musical or if it's also their politics. But yeah, am I just completely blanking on a band that deserves to be mentioned as very highly visible household name type of project from the US? If so, put it in the comments down below. Would love to hear from you. Until next time, we're going to wrap it up. So, everybody take care. And as always, keep banging your head.